This is the message, a carbon fiber suspension fork with more engineering in it than most complete bikes. It went on sale in 2018 for a jaw-dropping $2,700. It was expensive, it was weird, and in the right conditions, maybe unmatched. But I'm using the past tense for a reason. This product died like pretty much every other linkage fork that came before it. So what happened? Was it the price tag, the harsh ride, or that it wasn't particularly lightweight, or the 10 pivots you would need to service, or maybe how it made your bike look? Well, turns out the reason Truss Performance died is widely misunderstood. And with the bike boom and subsequent bike-pocalypse in our rearview mirror, we can do a proper postmortem on one of the ballsiest and divisive mountain bike products of the last decade. I'm Seth from Berm Peak, and I actually have tested other suspension products that look like praying mantises. So let's start with the obvious. The message is not a traditional telescoping fork. Far from a new concept, a linkage fork uses pivots and links instead of stanchions and bushings. We're all accustomed to the linkage found in the rear of full suspension bikes. It's true that suspension helps keep your wheels on the ground and softens hard landings, but it also moves around when you shift your body weight or apply your brakes, and you don't usually want that to happen. That's what's great about linkage. You can make trade-offs through engineering. For example, the linkage on my cross-country bike is nice and plush when I land or hit bumps on the trail, but while pedaling, it remains more or less planted. Through engineering, input from the rider and input from the trail will register differently. So a linkage fork gives engineers that same freedom up front. Some time ago, I tested the SCW1, which is an entire linkage bike that rides incredibly smooth. And so, the Truss message fork must be impossibly plush and sensitive, right? Not exactly. Ooh, I almost rattled my head loose. But this design allowed them to make the entire fork out of carbon fiber, so it must be super light, right? Negative. This fork was in fact heavier than competing products at half the price. And we know it debuted at $2,700, making it the most expensive mountain bike suspension fork ever. And so it's no wonder that Truss Performance went out of business. Back in 2018, people were calling this the trust fund fork, suggesting that only foolish rich people would buy it. But these criticisms were generally made by those who had never ridden the message. So were these armchair critics correct? Well, to answer that question, we'll need to ride it. First impressions of the Truss, the message fork. Let's hit this little diving board. Ooh, ooh, ooh. Okay, oh. Gotta be something wrong with this thing. All right, so I had set this up according to the user guide, but after a conversation with my friend Jeff Kendallweed, who rode for Truss for a year, I think I've got this more dialed in. Some of you may say, hey Seth, it's that 360 cam on the fork, it's unsprung mass. No, it's not. That was on the upper, which is stationary. What I just experienced confirms pretty much everything I have heard and read about this fork. I just wanted to see for myself. All right, this time let's commit all the way to the bottom. Ooh. Still feels harsh. Wow. Okay. Ooh. Ooh. I almost rattled my head loose. Okay, rear tire is flat. Oh. Oh. That's not good. It's starting to look like +1 for the armchair critics, but we need to dig deeper. How could such a seemingly bad product be so well made? A Reddit user noted in 2019 that it makes your bike look like ass immediately, but chances are they had never seen the message up close. Yes, it looks different, but also it's unbelievably polished. It oozes with detail and indicators of experience. Even the damper switch feels like a Swiss Army knife. In fact, your bike might look like rectum in comparison to this fork. But putting aside what the actual fork looks like, to me, it doesn't feel like it's forking. So was this another case of form over function? Let's rewind to 2015 when Trust Performance was founded. The three founders included suspension engineer Dave Weigel. Ever hear of DW Link? Well, you can guess what DW stands for. Jason Shears had previously founded NV Composites, providing a wealth of experience and connections in carbon fiber manufacturing. And Hap Saliga co-founded Competitive Cyclists, providing business and supply chain expertise. This was a dream team, and they cut absolutely no corners. They based their operations in Salt Lake City, Utah, and established a dedicated carbon manufacturing operation overseas. This is where they produced the chassis and linkage. And by 2018, the message fork went on sale. That's an insane timeline for such a complex and polished offering from a new company. And that harsh ride? It was by design. See, a telescoping fork like this one feels super plush at the top of its travel, but as it compresses, it gets firmer and more supportive. The message does just the opposite. It's backwards. While you're just cruising down the trail, it feels really firm, but dig deeper and it opens up. Users describe this as an on-off sensation. Like a light switch, it would go from totally locked up to wide open. And my video footage seems to show a suspension fork doing its job rather well. Some have compared this to a sports car with stiff suspension that trades ride quality for handling. But as one bike rumor commenter asked, so according to Trust, smooth isn't fast? That's a pretty valid question, but on my second run, I went fast enough to blow up my rear wheel. In corners, I felt confident. And the travel indicator was at 90% when all was said and done. What is happening here? Well, this design was intended to preserve your bike's geometry while maneuvering. For example, under heavy braking or cornering, you can expect the message to stay put. For an active rider that moves their body a lot or dives into really steep and chunky terrain, this can be very beneficial. And as Mike Levy implied in his long-term review, the message fork rewards riders who like to ride short travel bikes as if they're much bigger. If you're the kind of rider who treats a 130mm bike like an enduro rig, this fork makes that feel a lot more viable. I now feel sort of inadequate because I thought I was one of those riders. So why does this fork feel like duty to me? Well, Levy rode this thing for 6 months and retrained his brain. After decades on a telescoping fork, I'm anticipating a plush ride when I'm up here, and then I'm tensing up as it sinks into its travel. Because the fork behaves backwards, I'm riding it backwards. Maybe I should ride it some more and see if I can shake that feeling. All right, we're out here. I'm about to drop in. I think I've got this thing figured out. I took a lap this morning and it felt a lot better. I've got an admission to make. Back in 2018, Trust Performance reached out to me to send a fork for review, and I politely declined. I was newer to YouTube then, and I was getting recognized a lot out in public, and I didn't know how to handle it. My thinking was this would make me stick out like a sore thumb. Fast forward to today. I've been out here all day and lots of people have passed by me. Not one has noticed the weird fork, and I've talked to people, and I had to point the thing out, so go figure. Let's see how it feels now. The more I ride the message, the more I like it. Once you can better anticipate its behavior, the advantages become more obvious. What I found is that you don't want to be afraid to push into the fork. Land nose heavy, just dive into stuff. It just seems to feel better when you treat it like that. Still feels harsh to me, but better than it did. It's great for yanking though. Your bike's in the perfect position to do what you gotta do. Great in corners, weaving and scrubbing over stuff. This fork is definitely for somebody who knows how to control a bike. Yeah, I almost got tossed over the handlebars there. So I've got it figured out in some situations, but not all. It's kind of like the IPA of suspension forks. To normal people, it tastes like there's something wrong with it, but to others, it's exactly what they want. And the people who made it created exactly what they intended. And apparently people will pay up for it. But with a price of $2,700, there were few riders with a budget to take a gamble on this thing. So by mid-2019, Trust Performance dropped the price of the message to $1,975 and offered a $1,000 credit to existing customers. Now that credit was a nice gesture, but understandably, people still felt ripped off, having seemingly overpaid for the thing by close to $1,000. And the new price was still double what a high-end telescoping fork from the likes of Fox would have cost. Even at its reduced price, the Message was more expensive than the Lefty Ocho, which is also weird and niche, but the Lefty is spec'd on brand new bikes and backed by Cannondale. And it feels more like Modelo than a vile and bitter IPA. But get this, Trust Performance experienced a huge sales increase after that price drop, and the reviews started rolling in. The Lone Wolf reported that it was insanely fast in the rough and gave confidence when hitting corners at speed. Bike Rumor stated, the cornering benefits are real. Line holding in nasty off-camber corners is shockingly good. And at that point, Trust Performance had sponsored Jeff Kendall-Weed, who, given his following at the time, could probably have ridden for anyone he wanted. With all this online visibility, the other advantages of the Message became more widely known. Despite the 10 pivots, the damper, and 2 air springs, the service interval on the Message was 250 hours. That's more than double the competition. And initial tests showed that the fork was very robust and reliable. Some other things that inspired confidence were Trust's 2-year warranty and their no-fault crash replacement. And despite the Message's higher weight than competing telescopic forks, the Message's carbon chassis was incredibly stiff and robust. The tide was kind of turning, and in late 2019, Trust released the Shout, a 178mm enduro fork with the same ride characteristics as the Message. And it debuted at a lower price than the Message originally did at $2250. Still pretty insane. But sales numbers were increasing, and by that time, anyone buying a fork from Trust Performance kinda knew what they were in for. Against all odds, these very different looking, astoundingly expensive, backwards, upside down linkage forks with 10 pivots had seemingly found a market. Things were looking up, and all indicators pointed to additional momentum. Until April 2020, when Trust Performance, in their own words, suspended operations. And those operations are still suspended to this day. This was only months after they released the Shout, which people were apparently buying. What happened? Well, the pandemic happened. 2020 was regarded by many as the worst year ever, but we also remember the bike boom, which came on the tail of thousands of people suddenly working from home. Used bikes were selling for the price of new bikes, and new bikes were selling for over sticker. It was insane. As one Reddit user said, you know a bike parts manufacturer is slinging turds when they went out of business during the COVID bike boom. But at that time, we didn't have all the information we do now. If you really think back to the spring of 2020, bike shops were wondering how they were going to stay in business. Even when the demand shot up, there was no product available, and the smaller manufacturers, without the leverage of the big guys, were in really deep doo-doo. Trust Performance had only recently finished their first production run of the Shout, and they were probably short on cash. And with nobody willing to fund them during those uncertain times, they announced they were suspending operations. But as we already established, 5 years later, operations are still suspended. In fact, that bike boom turned into one of the worst busts we've ever seen. It's widely known as the bike-pocalypse. So consider for a moment where Trust would be today had they ridden out that initial drop in demand. They would have sold out of all the inventory they didn't have, and then, with their supply chain in purgatory, burned through even more cash. And as their supply chain came back online, they might have paid anything they could for the largest run they could muster, just like everyone else did. But when demand inevitably fell off a cliff and you could buy a Fox 36 for $450, the investors would have been far worse off than they are today. In fact, better funded, more established companies went belly up in that environment. So in hindsight, Trust Performance played an awful hand about as well as they could have. And actually, they kind of did it with class. My research shows that they made good on contracts and did their best to communicate with customers. They made preparations for Suspension Syndicate in Salt Lake City to take over service for the thousands of units already out there. In every way, Trust Performance suspended their operations as if they really intended on resuming someday. And I do wonder what could have been if the pandemic never happened. Now, Trust Performance needs no defending, especially not from me. Despite getting a little more used to this fork, I much prefer my Fox 34, and I most certainly wouldn't pay $2,000 for this thing. But the bulk of criticism hurled at Trust Performance was about the pricing. But I just don't see how something so complex, polished, and niche could have been instantly affordable. They would have needed to make something really crude, and then it might not have met expectations. You could point to a company like Amazon that sold stuff for cheap from the very start, but they lost money for 2 decades. A bike part startup would be unlikely to have the financial runway to do that. And had Trust designed something more mainstream with a potentially larger market, they'd have been competing with the big dogs on price and performance. Instead, Trust Performance tried their best to sell something different that you couldn't get from anyone but them. It was courageous, audacious, and by all accounts, a high-wire act. I give them nothing but props for it, even though this fork still kind of feels like it doesn't work. So, do I think Trust Performance will make a revival? Will they desuspend operations someday? Well, one thing's for sure, now is not a good time to do that. The appetite for ultra-expensive niche products is at a recent low, and in fact, there's another linkage fork in development aiming for a dramatically lower price point than the Message or Shout. And while we have yet to see how polished it will end up being, right now it looks a lot different than anything Trust had on offer. I wish the makers of the Rock Sled all the luck in the world. I hope you learned something today, and if you didn't, I hope you at least found this video entertaining. And if you love explainers and deep dives on weird bike stuff, please check out the playlist below. Thanks for riding with me today, and I'll see you next time.